Welcome to the first public meeting for the public involvement plan for the Buckley and Mann site. The objective and the purpose of tonight's meeting is for me to share with you the contents of the public involvement plan, which essentially lays out the framework for public involvement in the environmental response actions moving forward for the contaminated site at the former mill complex at the Buckley and Mann site. So just a brief outline. I'm going to talk a little bit about site history, but I'm not going to go into very much detail. The presentation that I gave at the ZBA meeting in June, I believe that's available for you to view and listen to online if you'd like to. And then during that presentation, went into a lot of detail about some of the historical investigation work that was done, got into some numbers, comparisons to Mass DEP standards, and then talked a little bit more about the RAO, the AUL, and then some of the post-RAO investigative work that was done, test pitting, and even some of the more recent information. But most of the discussion today was going to center on the public involvement plan, and again, this is the mechanism that's going to lay down the ground rules for how you can participate in the process as we move forward towards assessment and cleanup of the site. And then I'll wrap up with a quick discussion about what comes up next, what are the next steps in the process here, and it happens quickly. It'll happen quickly, so I'm sure we'll be back in this room or somewhere in Norfolk in the near future talking about the next steps for the project. I'm going to start off with this picture, which I really like. This is the complex circa the 1940s, I think, and I think it gives a good sense of what it looked like when it was an operational mill complex. And this also provides a nice opportunity to talk about the types of processes that were used at the facility, and what wastes were produced, and where those wastes may have come to lie as a result of the industrial operation. So, the first process I want to talk about is the carbonizer building, and carbonizing is a process that was used to separate fasteners from textiles.
You want a laser pointer?
Oh yeah, I've got one. Yeah, I've got one here. Yeah, thanks, Frank. And what they did was they used an acid bath, acid vapor, and what that would do would char the thin threads that, if you think about the thin threads that hold fasteners like buttons to a textile, it would char those off so that those could be easily separated. The textile would go one way for reuse, and the solid waste would go another way, go for disposal on site. We'll get to where. And then the liquid wastes from that process were neutralized with an alkaline solution, and then moved through a trench to a lagoon. We call this the carbonizer trench and the carbonizer lagoon. And the reason I'm going through this is I want to make sure that everybody's familiar with some of the terms and locations that we discuss as we go forward with this process. We're going to talk a lot about carbonizer lagoons and dye houses. I think this drawing is a nice intro to that. The second operation was a dye house operation, and did just what you would expect a dye house would do. Liquid waste from the dye house process would go out towards the west to Lagoons 1 and 2 through a channel. There was also a trench, a trench dye house that's since been cleaned with clean fill material. But these Lagoons 1 and 2 remain, and those will be subject of investigation as we move forward. But those received dye house wastes, which consisted of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, specifically 2-methylnaphthalene is one of the bad actors that we've found in samples in not only in these lagoons but also in the carbonizer lagoon, and heavy metals. Those are those, along with petroleum hydrocarbons, are the primary contaminants that were used at the facility here that have been found historically in environmental samples collected, and that will be the focus of investigations moving forward. There was the third lagoon. You'll see it on the next drawing. Lagoon number 3 reportedly never received wastes. It was a surface water runoff lagoon. It contained water but no wastewater, and we'll investigate that as well too to ensure that that's not contaminated. So far the assumption has been that there's no contamination in lagoon number 3. Area number 10, also we'll refer to it as the consolidation area, and so the remedy that was selected in the 1990s when most of this investigation was done, what they did was they consolidated solid waste into area number 10, made that, covered that with 3 feet of clean soil, vegetated it, and sort of like an on-site consolidation cell, they called it. And so that area number 10 was the landfill for the Buckley and Mann facility for many years. And so solid waste that came out of the carbonizers or the dye house, buttons and zippers and dye pastes that came out of the dye house, wasn't all inert stuff, were consolidated up here while the facility was operating. Part of the regular maintenance of these lagoons, Buckley and Mann would dredge out lagoons 1 and 2, and then they would leave piles of those dredge spoils to the south of those lagoons. Well, when they closed up the consolidation cell in the late 1990s, they took those piles and they brought them to Area 10, put them in the consolidation area. And knowing that it was a landfill facility and not a facility, a landfill, a place that they used to put waste, in the late 1990s, they excavated through that material and sort of sifted through it and looked for stuff that was, they really shouldn't stay there. So they found a lot of dye paste. It was, colored as obvious, easy to find, easy to identify, and they would take that off-site for disposal. They found some containers. They would take containers off-site. They found some building debris. They would segregate that out and took some of that material off-site. And so there was about 300 tons of material that they segregated while they were sifting through, for lack of a better term, all of the fill and waste material at Area 10 in 1999. And the stuff that they left, they judged was relatively not contaminated compared to the stuff that they sent off-site, the higher contamination stuff. And so that was essentially the remedy at the time. There was no further removal of sediment from the lagoons. These lagoons had been periodically dredged, as I discussed, and they didn't do any further removal, and they didn't do any removal of material from the carbonizer trench or lagoons. I didn't mention the tail race. The tail race is a remnant hydroelectric structure. There used to be connection between Bush Pond and the Mill River here. This part of the channel here has been filled in, but it was used to be the location of a water wheel, and so it would take flow from the pond up through the water wheel, create energy for the operation, and water would flow through the tail race up to the Mill River. Right now, the tail race pretty much dead ends right here where it was filled, and it receives water that backs up from the Mill River or surface water runoff from rain or seepage from groundwater. So I mentioned and here's a different view of it, and really the view that we'll use more. As you can see, the old carbonizer buildings were here. Here's their trench and the lagoon. You got the dye house here. There's the tail race, that filled-in channel, the tail race that goes up to the Mill River. The dye house, the trench that went from the dye house to the lagoons, filled in, was right here. Here's Lagoon 1, Lagoon 2, and Lagoon 3 I just added to this figure. That's we suspect was not a recipient of waste material. The last thing I haven't mentioned is the activity and use limitation. So I mentioned that there was contaminated material left behind underneath this consolidation cell. There was lagoon sediment, soil sediment, in the carbonizer in these lagoons 1 and 2, the dye house lagoons, there were contaminants left behind that didn't permit unrestricted use and unlimited exposure to these soils. And so to address that, the 2001 remedy included an activity and use limitation. And the activity and use limitation is something that's filed, recorded on the deed for the property. And what it does is it prohibits excavation or anything that's going to disturb or disrupt that soil cap so that it could stay in place and serve as a barrier to prevent humans from contacting the contaminated soil below the cover. The AUL also, let me talk about it on the next slide. So these are the limits of the AUL. You'll notice a couple things. Lagoon 3, as I said, reported not to have received wastewater. It was outside the AUL area, and the carbonizer lagoon outside the AUL area as well. A couple of rationales for excluding the carbonizer trench and the carbonizer lagoon. One was the sampling that they did there that was admittedly limited reached a conclusion that the contamination there was likely to degrade naturally over time. And secondly, and I think more pointedly, is this area here activities are limited in this area due to a wetlands restriction. And so that was somewhat of a de facto restriction to disturbing the soil in the lagoon. It was going to, I think they assumed that that would limit the exposure to soils that were left behind there. So for a couple of reasons, I believe that was the rationale of the folks that wrote the AUL and the RAO back in 2001 and why they excluded the carbonizer lagoon. I'm going to skip over a bunch of time here. I just was at 2001. I'm going to jump to 2017. There's been additional investigation between 01 and 2017, soil sampling, groundwater sampling, surface water sampling. Most of it centered around efforts to redevelop the property, either a previous development or the current development. But I'm going to skip to 2017 because that's really what gets us to where we are today. In 2017, in the fall, Mass DEP audited the RAO for the site. Now, when we say audited, let me explain what that means a little bit. The waste site cleanup process in Massachusetts is governed by the Massachusetts Contingency Plan. That's MCP, is that acronym that you're going to hear us use continually. And the MCP sets forth the regulations for site assessment, risk assessment, and site cleanup in Massachusetts. And licensed site professionals, LSP, are the ones that are given the licensure by the state and the authority to make decisions on whether the assessment and cleanup actions are adequate to meet the regulations. So think about what that means. The state is deferring to licensed professionals to make decisions on whether or not the assessment and cleanup work at a particular hazardous waste site is adequate and meets the regulations. So states reserve the right to, there's something called a tier 1 site and a tier 2 site. And tier 1 sites tend to be a little bit maybe more contaminated, or maybe they're in areas where there's more exposure to the contamination. Maybe it's closer to residential, or in a precious, valuable resource, a river resource. And Mass DEP tends to have more oversight and pay closer attention to tier 1 sites. Buckley and Mann's a tier 2 site, so those decisions are delegated fully to the LSP, but the state reserves the right to come back after the fact, a lot like the IRS, and say, hey, well, I'm going to review the decisions that you made and the information that you collected, and I'm going to decide whether those are adequate and those really comply with the regulations. So DEP opted to do that for this site in 2017, and they do it on a routine basis. That's their way of sort of looking over the back of the LSPs to make sure that they're doing their job, and they're not trying to pull a fast one. An NOAF is a notice of audit findings, and if and when the DEP finds that there were some deficiencies in the RAO, they issue a notice of audit findings, and that's what happened in November of 2017. And these are the non-compliance issues that were identified in the NOAF letter. And so you've got 3 of them. The first 3 are, I call them administrative. They can be handled with paperwork. The 4th one is a little bit more significant in that it really required us to go back out and collect more data. We needed to go back and look at the site and the areas of the site where they were sampled previously, what the information we have, and do we have enough to make that to evaluate the environmental risk, which was something that the original RAO document in 2001 did not do. Environmental risks to ecological receptors, so animals, plants, earthworms, because earthworms are low in the food chain. So, it's a comprehensive look at whether the contamination at the site has an impact on ecological receptors. That was not done in 2001, and Mass DEP pointed that out. And so Buckley and Mann has moved forward to do that. DEP established a May 17th deadline. It turned out that the work that's needed to make that environmental assessment, complete that environmental assessment, and then go back and rewrite the permanent solution report, the RAO, it was going to take more than 180 days. So on May 14th, we retracted the permanent solution and terminated the AUL, which brought us back to an earlier phase of cleanup, essentially opened the site back up It was no longer closed in the eyes of Mass DEP, and that's where we are today. Shortly after the May 14th, now we'll get into some public involvement discussion. On May 23rd, the citizens of Norfolk filed a petition, sent a petition to establish a public involvement plan. That is your right under the MCP. There's a section in the MCP that outlines how the public can get more involved in sites where they're concerned about the adequacy of the response actions being taken, or they want to express their concerns. And so that right was exercised on May 23rd. And I think that's 20 days later, we wrote back a letter acknowledging the receipt of the petition, that it was done correctly in accordance with the MCP, and that's established the PIP. A couple weeks later, we sent a letter out soliciting input, community concerns, received your concerns, and put them into a brief write-up here in the public involvement plan. On the 23rd, we are required to post a public notice and then provide written notice to all the people on our mailing list 14 days in advance of a public meeting. And here we are on August 7th. This is our first public meeting of the PIP, and so my purpose is to present the public involvement plan document to you so that you can now go back and read it. This is the start of a 20-day comment period, and that allows, during which you can provide comments to us for our consideration before we finalize the public involvement plan. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. So if everyone has a copy of the document, I'm just going to go through section by section, give you an outline of the document, talk a little bit about what it contains, and then that's basically what I have. So section 1 is an introduction, basic site information, timeline that we just went over about the PIP, when the petition was filed, when the PIP was established, talks about this public meeting, and then provides an outline of the rest of the document. In section 2, there's a little site description there. It talks about the history, a lot of the information I just shared here, so I kind of jumped ahead. Historical site use, what went on at the site, what contaminants have been found, what response actions have been taken, talks a little bit about the remedy. And then you can see at the bottom of, at the end of section 2, talks about the audit, and then provides a little information about the public involvement history again. Section 3 starts to talk a little bit about the framework that we're going to use here moving forward for the public involvement plan. Talks about the MCP process. I explained that a little bit already. The MCP has a phased process, a tier 2 site, again, under the oversight of an LSP who makes the decisions for where you're going to sample, how much is enough sampling, have we done an adequate risk characterization, and what's the appropriate remedy to mitigate any risk, to make sure that the human health and the environment are protected. And so there's a very structured, phased process that's used in the MCP to reach that end goal. The end goal is a permanent solution. So when you hear permanent solution, that's basically the site closure document that says that where the LSP attests or renders an opinion that all the response actions have been taken in compliance with the MCP, and this site is achieved a condition of no significant risk. Those are some of the key MCP buzzwords that you'll hear a lot of. And we talk a little bit about the public role, really much more in section 4. Section 4, I see that as the bulk of how this thing's going to work. And so the public involvement activities involve two major facets. First is in informing the public, and the second is soliciting concerns. So how are we going to inform the public? So first off, the best and easiest way to see historical documents and then anything that we submit through the public involvement plan is online at the Mass DEP's website. So Mass DEP is really way ahead of other states with their environmental agency in the public availability of documents. And there's a link in section 4.1.1 that'll take you directly to an online repository in the Mass DEP's website where you can find all the historical documents and where we will post this PIP, as well as other documents as they're completed along the process here. If you don't have internet access, these files are also can be reviewed at the Mass DEP Central Office in Worcester. They'll always find them there. There's an address and hours if you would like to review files at the Central Office in Worcester. We've also established local repositories at the Franklin Public Library and right here at the Norfolk Public Library. If you go to the reference desks at either library, I've been working with the reference librarians to be sure that folks that are looking to review documents that are in the public domain, they can walk right up and request them. They can sit there, they can sit in the library and review them to generate comments or any other feedback that you have. So that's document availability. There's also a site mailing list, and I'm sure most of you have received, I hope most of you received mailings. They haven't been returned to me. The site mailing list has started off with the list of petitioners that signed the May petition, added some local officials, other stakeholders, local politicians are on the mailing list. There's a copy of the mailing list provided in the document here as well. So the site mailing list is used to announce public comment periods, public meetings, to announce the availability of documents. And so you'll continue to get correspondence through the mail from us as the process moves forward. There's also a site notification list, and the site notification list is a subset of the mailing list, and those are mostly local officials. We put the lead petitioner on that list, but it's local officials, state rep, state senator, and that list is used to notify this list, the people on this list, in some special milestones, like if we're going to go out and we'll do field work, that's an email to that list to say, hey, I think we're obligated to do it a day before, but we try to do more notice than that. This is planned. We have a field event planned. We're going to go out on this day. We're going to be out there for this many days, and that's just a quick way for us to be able to communicate to key stakeholders what's going on the site. And there are a couple other milestones too, where a notification, an email to the notification list is warranted, just as a quicker way than through the mail into a more targeted audience. And the idea there is that those folks then can disseminate information to other people in the community after receiving that email. So let me move on to the mechanisms that we'll use to solicit the concerns of the public. And first is public comment period. So for each MCP deliverable that we submit, we'll hold a public meeting. The public meeting will be noticed 14 days before. Letters will go out informing the mailing list that there's a public meeting, that there's a document that will be out. That draft document will be published the day of the public meeting, just as the public involvement plan was. And that meeting will mark the start of a 20-day public comment period on that document. And public comments can be submitted to me. My email address is in here. And those during that 20-day period. At the close of the 20-day period starts another period where the project team prepares responses to comments. And those responses to comments are then sent to the public repository or uploaded to Mass DEP's website. And then and the letter goes out to the mailing list that says the responses to comments have been posted. You get a chance to see our responses to comments. And then after the comments are all responded to, we revise the document and submit a final response, a final report that goes up on the DEP's website. Again, will show up on the repository as well. And so that's an opportunity for us to get your feedback and your comments on the proposals that are being made for response actions, and then for us to provide our rationale on why we did or did not incorporate that feedback into the final plan. That's a step that's typically not taken unless there's a public involvement plan for a site. It's usually the LSP will issue one version of a report and then move on to the next step in the process. So this is sort of add some time into the process that allows the public to take a look at what's being proposed, provide comments on what's being proposed, and potentially have an impact on what gets done. So we move on to section 5. Section 5 is not much text here, but the schedule for public involvement is in one of the exhibits, so you can see some specific dates. So where are we going to go from here? Well, today's the release of the draft PIP, posted to EDEP later today. It's at the repositories. Folks that are here at the meeting have a copy of it, a hard copy of it. It begins the 20-day comment period. We'll take comments on the public involvement plan until August 27th, and then responses and a final plan will be issued before September 26th. Section 6 talks about the responsibility for implementing the plan. Right now it's De Placido Development on behalf of Buckley and Mann will be implementing the PIP. And there is an appeal process if you don't think that we are following the prescription in this PIP. So if we're not making our notices, if we're not responding to comments in a timely manner, then there's an appeal process where, very much like the petition process, where 10 community members can petition to have Mass DEP review our adherence to this public involvement plan. So that brings us to the next steps. So very shortly, we've been working collaboratively with the town and with the town's LSP, Frank, to come up with a scope of work for our field investigations coming up. It's called the Phase 2 scope of work. That's where we lay out our plan to collect data so that we can get to the environmental risk characterization, human health risk characterization, and you can see how the process goes on. Evaluate cleanup options, revise the AUL language, establish a plan for maintenance and monitoring of the AUL, and then prepare and submit a permanent solution statement. That's the roadmap to get to the end. And I put here, you'll see that there's public involvement opportunities all along the way. That doesn't mean that there will be separate meetings for each of these. Many of these will be combined into one submittal, so these risk characterizations and the cleanup options and these will be combined into a single submittal, but they will all be part of this process. Public notice, 14 days, public meeting, public comment period, response to comments. That interaction will happen at each submittal. You'll have the opportunity for public input. And that's all I had for today. Again, the objective here was just to introduce you to the public involvement process, run through quickly the public involvement plan, and then kick off the 20-day comment period for public involvement activities. Be happy to take people's questions or comments. If you have anything here, I understand you just saw the document minutes ago. I'd like to keep the comments focused on the public involvement plan itself. We will have a chance to dig into sampling plans and the like very shortly. We're looking at a public meeting in September to talk about the Phase 2 scope of work as soon as we get with the town, sort of vet through the town, and then decide that we're on the, we agree where we should go next. We will go through the cycle again. We will submit notice and then provide a draft Phase 2 scope of work for the public's review and comment. All right, well, hearing none, thanks very much for coming out. We will see you again very shortly. And don't forget, all the contact information here for email. We'd like to receive comments in email. It's just a little bit easier to track that way. But at any time you feel like you want to talk about, give a verbal comment or talk about it, I believe my phone number is on are in the letters that I've been sending out, and my email address is in here as well. So feel free, give me a call if you want to talk about any of these submittals. I will end up asking you to submit something formally through email ultimately, just so we have a good record of it. But I'm here to listen to your thoughts and concerns and to share about the process, the assessment and remediation process that we're going to move through to get this site, everybody comfortable that we've achieved a condition of no significant risk and we're back to permanent solution. Thanks very much.